The sun hammered down merciless and white over the cotton fields that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, like an ocean frozen in place. Cloud's Fisher stood alongside nearly 200 other German prisoners, their hands trembling visibly in the Texas heat. They were certain, absolutely certain, that this was where it would end. This was the execution line. For weeks, they'd been fed stories, terrible stories whispered from one barracks to another, passed hand to hand like poisoned currency. American soldiers shot prisoners without hesitation. They burned them, they starved them methodically, the way you torture animals you wanted dead. Every propaganda film they'd ever seen confirmed it. Every training officer had warned them. This was what awaited the captured. Then something unexpected happened. The guards moved among them distributing blankets. Real blankets, worn and scratchy but solid, hot soup steamed in cups. Coffee emerged, genuine coffee, not the bitter acorn substitute they'd been drinking since 1942. On one September Sunday, something happened that seemed impossible. Tables appeared laden with hand-cranked ice cream and ice-cold Coca-Cola bottles sweating in the sun. When the first prisoner tasted the Coca-Cola, he went utterly still. His eyes widened, tears began streaming down his face. Then another man started crying. Then another. Then the whole yard erupted, men weeping openly, not from despair. From something they thought the war had destroyed completely, the sensation of being treated like a human being again. The rattling truck bed beneath clouds jolted over roads that seemed to stretch forever across Texas, disappearing into a wavering horizon. His fingers gripped the wooden slats so tightly he felt splinters drive into his palms. He needed that pain. It kept him grounded in his body, stopped him from falling entirely into the terror that had wrapped itself around his ribs like barbed wire ever since American soil appeared 3 days behind them. 200 German prisoners swayed around him with the truck's rhythm, their faces the color of old ash. Exhaustion marked every face, but something deeper lived there too. Resignation, the particular acceptance of men who'd already whispered their farewells to people they'd never see again. Clouds had whispered his own somewhere over the Atlantic, pressed against the transport ship's metal hull while his stomach turned itself inside out into a bucket, his mind playing and replaying every brutality documented in the propaganda films he'd watched since childhood. Americans didn't accept prisoners. That's what he'd been taught. They took revenge. The films had made it crystal clear. Captured soldiers pressed against execution walls, bodies abandoned in ditches, systematic torture delivered with mechanical efficiency. Clouds was 19 years old, and he knew with the kind of certainty that comes from total belief that he would not live to be 20. The trucks decelerated, then stopped completely. Through gaps in the canvas covering, Clouds caught his first genuine glimpse of Camp Swift. Wooden barracks stretched across flat terrain, dotted with scrub brush and dust. Guard towers rose at measured intervals, their silhouettes sharp against the late afternoon sky. It looked precisely as he'd imagined a death camp would look. Orderly, efficient, final. The tailgate dropped with a metallic crash that made every prisoner flinch violently. American guards stood waiting, faces unreadable beneath the shadow of helmet brims. One barked something in English that Clouds didn't comprehend, but the meaning transcended language. Disembark, form lines. His legs shook as his boots touched Texas soil. The sun bore down with a ferocity nothing like the damp, bone-deep cold of the Eastern Front. For one wild moment, he thought perhaps they'd shoot them right here, right now, eliminate the problem before any paperwork complicated things. Instead, a guard began distributing blankets down the line, actual blankets, drab and scratchy, but undeniably real. Clouds accepted his automatically, his mind struggling to process the gesture. Another guard followed with canteen cups of steaming soup. The smell hit him like a memory he couldn't quite place. Vegetables, salt, something that might have been chicken. His hands trembled so badly he nearly dropped the cup. Nobody drank. The prisoners stood frozen, cups clutched in their hands, waiting for the trick to reveal itself. Clouds watched the steam rise and vanish into the August heat. Poison, probably. Or a test. Drink and prove your weakness. Drink and prove your willingness to betray everything you've been taught for a moment's comfort. His Hitler Youth instructors' voices echoed in his memory like ghosts. The enemy will offer false kindness to shatter your resolve. Real soldiers refuse, but his stomach cramped with a hunger that transcended empty, a hunger that lived in his bones and screamed. The guard who'd handed him the soup had already walked away, indifferent to whether Clouds drank from it or not. That detail felt wrong. If this was a test, wouldn't they observe? Clouds glanced at Ernst Weber, the older man beside him who'd taught mathematics in Berlin before the war. Ernst's face had gone pale, his eyes distant and fixed on something no one else could see. He wasn't drinking either. They were herded into a barracks with rough wooden walls and rows of bunks topped with actual mattresses that smelled like lye soap. Clouds claimed a bottom bunk near the door and sat holding his now cooling soup, waiting. Around him, men whispered theories and fears like contraband passed in darkness. This was just holding. The real camp was hidden elsewhere. They'd be transported during the night. The soup was definitely poisoned. Why else would they give it away for nothing? Clouds wanted to believe the logic, wanted the certainty it offered, but something about it felt hollow, insubstantial. He'd seen American supply depots during the retreat, mountains of food and equipment stretching beyond what his mind could calculate. Maybe to Americans, soup wasn't precious. Maybe it was just soup. He forced himself to take one sip. The broth was thin but genuine, salt and warmth blooming across his tongue. Nothing happened. No burning, no immediate collapse. He took another sip, then another. By the time the cup was empty, his hands had stopped shaking quite so badly, though the knot in his chest remained, stubborn and heavy. Night fell suddenly in Texas, fast as a curtain dropping. Clouds lay on his bunk, still fully dressed, boots laced, waiting. Through the window, he could see guard towers lit against the darkness, and beyond them, stars brighter than any he'd seen through the smoke and ash of Europe. He pulled his brother's last letter from his pocket, the paper thin as tissue from being folded and unfolded countless times. Heinrich had written it from Stalingrad 3 weeks before the end came. The words were cheerful lies. "We'll share Christmas together, you'll see." Clouds had memorized every one. Somewhere outside, guards changed shifts with quiet voices, boots scraping across gravel. Inside the barracks, men breathed in the rhythm of restless sleep. Nobody had died. Nobody had been dragged away. The propaganda had promised horror, but what Clouds discovered instead was somehow worse. Uncertainty. The not knowing whether mercy was real or simply another weapon they hadn't yet learned to recognize. Morning arrived with a guard named Jim Cooper, though on that second day he was simply another American face delivering breakfast on metal trays. Eggs, toast, coffee that smelled so rich it made Clouds feel lightheaded from the aroma alone. Real coffee, genuine and fragrant, and nothing like anything he'd encountered in 2 years. He ate slowly, testing each bite for poison that never came, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, his stomach didn't cramp around emptiness. The other prisoners ate the same way, suspicious and hungry in equal measure, stealing glances at each other as though to confirm they weren't all hallucinating the same shared dream. By afternoon, Clouds had volunteered for the work detail. 50 cents a day, they'd been told during orientation, credited to camp accounts. The money could be saved, sent home through Red Cross channels, if home still existed. Clouds didn't let himself think too carefully about that if. He simply signed his name on the roster and reported to the assembly area where guards organized prisoners into groups of 20. Jim Cooper was assigned as supervisor for Clouds' detail, and Clouds studied him the way he'd learned to study officers during the war, searching for the tells that revealed which ones would break you purely for entertainment and which ones simply wanted the day to finish. Cooper was lean and weathered, somewhere approaching 30, moving with a farmer's economy of gesture. He didn't waste energy on cruelty, but he didn't offer warmth either. He was a door neither open nor closed, and Clouds couldn't read him at all. The work was cotton picking, rows stretching toward horizons that shimmered with heat. Clouds had never touched cotton before, never felt the bolls catch and tear under his fingers, or the way the sun pressed down like a physical weight on his shoulders. It was difficult work, honest work, and there was something almost cleansing about it. Nobody was shooting, nobody was dying, He simply pulled cotton and dropped it in the long sack, dragging behind him. And the rhythm became something like meditation. The local farmer whose land they worked was named Haz, an older man with a face carved from decades of sun and labor, hands that had clearly spent their entire lives doing exactly what he was asking them to do. He treated the prisoners the way Clouds imagined he treated any laborers, fairly, without sentiment, but without cruelty either. When the heat peaked in early afternoon, Hees brought water in a metal canteen and passed it down the line, drinking first before handing it to Clouds. The gesture stopped him mid-reach. In every propaganda film, in every training session, they'd been taught that Americans considered Germans subhuman, unworthy of sharing air, let alone water. Yet here stood this farmer, offering his own canteen with the casual indifference of someone who'd never questioned whether Clouds deserved to drink. Clouds took the canteen with shaking hands and drank. The water was warm and tasted like metal, and it was the most dignifying thing anyone had offered him since surrender. Jim watched from his position in the shade of Heis's truck. He'd been observing Clouds all morning, noting the way the kid worked without complaint, the way he'd stopped twice to help Ernst Weber when the older man struggled keeping pace in the heat. It reminded Jim of something, someone, and he hated the recognition forming in his chest before it fully crystallized. Tommy had been like that. Always helping the slower guys, carrying extra weight without being asked, making terrible jokes to ease tension before a fight. Tommy had been good, the kind of good that made the whole world feel less heavy, and he'd died in France doing something stupidly brave that saved 3 men and cost him everything. Jim had volunteered for guard duty thinking it would help, thinking that seeing the enemy up close would satisfy something Tommy's death had carved out of him. Instead, he just kept seeing boys tired and scared and probably carrying their own ghosts of brothers. When the workday ended and they loaded back into trucks, Jim found himself standing near Clouds. The silence stretched awkward between them until Jim heard himself ask, "You got family?" Clouds froze, his face going carefully blank in the way Jim recognized from men trying not to break apart. Then in halting English that came out more German than not, Clouds said, "Brother, dead, Stalingrad. Maybe parents, I don't know." Jim nodded once, a sharp dip of his chin. The words came out before he could stop them. "My brother too, France." They didn't speak again. Clouds climbed into the truck, and Jim turned away to count heads, and something had shifted between them that neither knew how to name. It wasn't friendship, it was barely even acknowledgement, but it was the first crack in the wall of us and them, and through it came the uncomfortable truth that grief looked the same in any language. September brought cooler evenings and an announcement that spread through the camp like wildfire. The camp commander, responding to Red Cross recommendations and directives to improve morale, had authorized a Sunday recreation day. A guard named Maggie Cooper read the details aloud in the mess hall, her German flawless and precise, translating from the official notice while prisoners leaned forward to catch every word. There would be a baseball game, she said, music from the camp band. Then she paused, as if not quite believing it herself, before adding that the Red Cross had sent supplies and local churches had donated goods. There would be ice cream and Coca-Cola. The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. Ernst Weber broke it first with a laugh that sounded more like a cough. "Ice cream," he repeated in German. "They're testing our loyalty. Someone who accepts will be marked as a collaborator." But his eyes held something that looked dangerously close to hope, and Clouds felt the same traitorous flutter in his chest. He hadn't tasted anything sweet since before the war, since Sunday afternoons in München when his mother would make apple cake, and Heinrich would steal extra slices when she wasn't looking. The memory felt so distant, it might have belonged to someone else entirely. Sunday arrived with cloudless skies and heat that felt almost gentle compared to August's brutality. Jim showed up even though he was off duty, drawn by something he couldn't name and didn't want to examine too closely. Maggie had asked him to come, said it would be good for him to see the prisoners as people rather than problems, and he'd agreed mostly to stop her from asking again. Long tables had been set up in the recreation yard, covered with red and white checked cloths that looked absurdly cheerful against the dust and wire. Coolers packed with ice sweated in the sun, Bottles of Coca-Cola nestled inside like buried treasure. Hand-cranked ice cream churns sat at intervals, already being worked by a mix of prisoners and guards who'd been volunteered for the task. Clouds approached one of the tables the way he might approach a trap, slow and careful, watching for the catch. A guard he didn't recognize handed him a bottle of Coca-Cola already opened, condensation running down the green glass. Clouds seemed to press down on the bottle like it might shatter from the weight of hope. Around him, other prisoners clutched their own drinks, hands trembling slightly, but nobody moved to drink yet. Everyone was waiting, watching, hoping someone else would take that first step into something resembling normal. Then a young man from Munshin went for it. He couldn't have been more than 20, with features still soft enough to betray that he'd been barely grown when the war consumed everything. He raised the bottle to his lips and drank long and deep, the liquid disappearing down his throat before he froze completely. His eyes went wide, then they glistened. Then his whole body buckled with sobs that shook through him so violently the Coca-Cola sloshed dangerously inside the bottle. Another prisoner began weeping. Then another started moving, dancing almost. Clouds brought the bottle up, and when the fizzy sweetness hit his tongue, something shifted in him that he couldn't quite name but absolutely recognized. It was the taste of ordinary days, Sunday afternoons and small-town shops, and choosing to drink soda because you wanted it, not because your throat was closing from thirst. It was the flavor of being human again, instead of just enduring. The weight of everything they'd lost cracked open inside him. He thought of Heinrich and those ice cream cones they'd shared, strawberry for Heinrich and vanilla for Klaus, how Heinrich always finished first and pretended he didn't want more, even though Klaus always surrendered the last bite anyway. Then the ice cream came, handed out in small bowls that felt as precious as fine porcelain. Klaus chose vanilla because it connected him to something real, something before. When that first cold sweetness touched his tongue, he shut his eyes against the flood of memory that felt like drowning. This wasn't really about ice cream, it was about what the ice cream meant, about childhood and peace and the dangerous belief that the world could be gentle. All those things they'd been forced to forget were being returned to them one melting spoonful at a time. These weren't soldiers anymore. They were shattered people crying over ice cream because someone had chosen to treat them like human beings who mattered. Maggie appeared at his side, her hand light against his arm. "You see it now?" she asked quietly. Jim nodded because he couldn't form words, because Tommy would have loved this moment. Tommy would have been the one turning the ice cream, cracking jokes, struggling through German phrases to make these men laugh. Tommy had always seen people before he saw enemies, and he died never knowing that some of the men who killed him might have wept over Coca-Cola too. Klaus found Jim after finishing his bowl, still holding it carefully between both hands like it might vanish. His English came slowly but with determination. "Thank you," he said, "for this, for not killing us." Jim took the bowl, their fingers meeting briefly in the exchange. "War's not over," he said, the words coming out harder than intended. "No," Klaus agreed. His eyes were still red but clear now, and something steadier lived behind them. "But maybe we can remember we are still human." Jim nodded sharp and certain, because what else could he do? Klaus was right, and accepting that truth felt like the hardest thing. Days later, Maggie discovered Klaus in the recreation yard, coaching Ernst through English grammar. She held a thin envelope, and Klaus knew before she spoke what it contained. He'd been waiting for that letter since August. His mother's handwriting marked the outside, cramped and uneven, in a way that made his chest tighten instantly. Maggie handed it over without ceremony, just a gentle touch to his shoulder before stepping away to grant privacy he didn't actually want. Klaus read it standing, then sat on the nearest bench and read it again slowly, as though changing his pace might somehow alter the words on the page. His mother was alive, and that should have been enough. That should have been everything. But his father was gone, crushed beneath rubble when a bomb had torn directly through their building in July. Their house no longer existed. The street where he'd grown up was obliterated. His mother was sleeping on concrete in a church basement with 40 other families, lying on a thin mat, eating whatever aid workers distributed. She was starving. Everyone in the entire city was starving, scavenging through ruins for anything burnable or remotely edible, trading worthless things for other equally worthless things. But worse than this catalogue of destruction was the final paragraph, where the pen had pressed so hard that it had torn through the paper in places. She carried shame, shame for what Germany had become, what they had all allowed to happen by staying silent when they should have spoken. She asked for forgiveness for raising him in lies, for letting him believe in a vision of Germany constructed entirely on the suffering of others. She'd written that she thanked God for his safety, grateful he'd escaped the madness, yet she prayed constantly that he wouldn't hate her for her blindness. Klaus folded the letter with care and walked to the fence. He stood there as afternoon dissolved into evening, fingers clenched around the wire until his knuckles blanched completely white, then lost all feeling. Behind him the camp continued its ordinary rhythms, work details returning, the aroma of dinner wafting from the mess hall, someone playing a harmonica in one of the barracks, all those everyday sounds that felt somehow like condemnation. Jim found him after dark, drawn by instinct or possibly terrible luck. Klaus remained at the fence, a silhouette against the floodlights from the watchtowers. Jim approached carefully, the way you'd approach something frightened, and stopped several feet back. He didn't ask what was troubling him. He could see the letter gripped in Klaus's fingers, could read devastation in the rigid tension of his spine. "I should have died," Klaus whispered finally, his voice barely audible. "I'm safe here. I have food. I have ice cream." The word emerged bitter and contemptuous. "She's starving in ruins we created." Jim had no response for that. What could he possibly say? That Klaus's survival wasn't his responsibility, that war victimized everyone. The words felt empty before they even formed, so he simply remained in that uncomfortable silence and let Klaus carry his grief. "She says she's ashamed," Klaus continued, his voice splintering. "Ashamed of Germany, ashamed she couldn't see. How do I respond to that? How do I tell her I didn't see either? I believed every single thing they taught us. I was proud to serve, and now I can only think about how many people are dead, because we were all too cowardly or too foolish to question whether we were wrong." Jim remembered Tommy's letters home, each one packed with manufactured optimism and careful silences. Tommy had never written about the things that kept him awake in the darkness. He'd never mentioned the villages they'd walked through, or the families fleeing on the roads, or the questions that had no good answers. He died still believing completely in the rightness of their cause, and Jim both envied that certainty and grieved for it. "You can't carry all of it," Jim said at last. "What your country did, what happened to your family. You can't repair it from here, and punishing yourself won't make anything right. Then what can I do?" Klaus turned to face him fully, and beneath the harsh tower lights, his face appeared far older than 19 years should allow. "What's the purpose of surviving if I can't help her, if I can't do anything at all?" Jim took time before answering. He looked at Klaus truly, really looked at him, and recognized a teenager trying to shoulder responsibility that belonged to generals and politicians, and an entire generation that had looked away because looking would have demanded sacrifice. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "But standing at this fence until you vanish isn't the answer." Klaus turned back to the wire, and Jim recognized he should leave, should allow the kid space to process whatever needed processing. Yet he thought of Tommy at a fence just like this one, or maybe alone in a foxhole carrying weight that was never his to carry. So Jim stayed. He didn't talk, didn't offer the comfort he wasn't qualified to give. He simply stood there in the Texas darkness while Klaus gripped the fence and worked to understand how to continue living when everyone he loved was dying beneath the rubble of everything he'd once believed in. October brought mornings cold enough that breath became visible, and Klaus moved through existence like something not quite present. He participated in work details because refusing would demand explanation he couldn't provide, and the grayness had settled over everything like dust. He ate because Ernst placed food directly in front of him and watched until he swallowed. He occupied that space between living and surrender, and Jim observed it unfold with a helplessness that mirrored watching Tommy's letters arrive with decreasing frequency until they stopped entirely. Then one morning, Jim found Klaus in the barracks and told him Maggie wanted to see him. Klaus followed without questioning, without even wondering, simply another instruction in a life that had become nothing but following orders. Maggie had paperwork spread across her desk, her expression both gentle and determined. She described the new Red Cross program in careful German and then repeated it in English because Klaus's understanding had progressed significantly. Prisoners could transmit portions of their wages home through international relief organizations. The amount wasn't substantial, maybe $20 or $30, but it represented something concrete. It meant action. Klaus stared at the form like it was composed in an unfamiliar language. "It won't change anything," he said flatly, voice entirely hollow. Jim leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "No," he agreed, "but it's what you can do from here, right now." Klaus picked up the pen. His hand trembled slightly as he completed the form, printing his mother's name and the church address in deliberate, measured letters. $25. It felt simultaneously monumental and thoroughly inadequate. He signed his name and slid the form across to Maggie, and something about that physical choice to act instead of surrender cracked the grayness just marginally. That afternoon, during the work detail, Mr. Hayes noticed something different. Klaus couldn't explain exactly what had shifted, only that he was actually present in a way he hadn't been for weeks. When they broke for water, Hayes approached Jim and asked in his characteristically brief manner if the boy was doing better. Jim explained in general terms, cautious not to violate confidence, and Hayes simply nodded. Then he did something entirely unexpected. He walked to his truck, retrieved a small burlap sack, and extended it to Klaus. "Pecans from his own trees still in their shells," Hayes said without elaboration. "For your mother, include them in your next package." Klaus stared at that bag like it contained something precious beyond measure. "Why?" he asked, and that single word carried everything he couldn't articulate. "Why would you give me anything? Why would you care about a German woman you'll never know? Why show kindness when hatred would be simpler?" Hayes shifted uncomfortably at the scrutiny. "Because war finishes someday. Kindness doesn't have to." Klaus and Ernst sat in the barracks cracking pecans using a flat rock they'd discovered near the fence. The rhythm was meditative, the sharp sound of breaking shell and the careful removal of meat. Ernst talked about his daughter while they worked, sharing genuine stories rather than sanitized memories. Klaus told him about Heinrich and the ridiculous arguments they'd had, about how his brother used to pilfer his socks. They filled a small tin with pecan halves, and Klaus set it aside for the next Red Cross package. For the first time since that letter arrived, something other than grey moved through him. He began writing to his mother that evening, and this time the words emerged differently. Not just apologies, though those were present. Plans. He described learning English, the work details, the garden the prisoners had cultivated behind the barracks. He wrote about Mr. Hayes and the pecans, about unexpected generosity from people who had every reason to despise them. Then he wrote the thing he'd feared saying, "When I come home, I'll help rebuild, not the old Germany, something better." Her response arrived 3 weeks later, and Klaus read it aloud to Ernst in the quiet evening. She'd received the money and divided it among neighbors who needed it more desperately. American soldiers had distributed aid packages containing medicine and food. She described small acts of compassion. The way rubble was being cleared stone by stone, the way people were electing to offer help instead of punishment. "We were informed they would obliterate us," she'd written. "Instead, they are helping us stand." The words circulated through the barracks as Klaus translated them. Propaganda versus actual experience. The space between what they'd been instructed to believe and what was genuinely occurring. Other prisoners shared comparable letters, accounts of occupied cities receiving support rather than cruelty. Mercy extended when revenge would have been justified. They started referring to themselves as Coca-Cola prisoners, not ironically, but as a reminder of the afternoon they'd reclaimed their own humanity. When another social gathering arrived, Klaus helped Jim arrange tables without the tension of expecting some cruel surprise. They worked in comfortable silence, and when Jim handed Klaus a strand of lights to suspend, their hands met and neither pulled back as quickly as they might have months earlier. "After the war," Klaus said carefully, testing the words, "do you imagine Germans and Americans can become friends?" Jim considered Tommy. considered every reason to answer no, but he looked at Klaus and recognized someone attempting to construct something worthwhile from the destruction of everything broken. "Yeah," he said at last, "I think some of us already are."